Day. Over the last 2 days, the last two videos, I have been discussing the very strong Russian response to the statements by President Macron and British Foreign Secretary Cameron, the summoning of the British and French ambassadors to the Russian Foreign Ministry, the handing out to these two ambassadors of exceptionally strong warnings. The correct diplomatic term for these kind of protests and warnings, by the way, is a démarche from the Russian Foreign Ministry to the French and the British, and the quite clearly expressed threat set out in black and white in the Russian readout of the meeting with the British ambassador, the Russian threat previously made by President Putin that if British missiles struck Russian territory, then the Russians would be at liberty to retaliate, would consider themselves at liberty to retaliate against British military assets anywhere in the world, including potentially in Britain itself. All of this obviously combined with the announcement by the Russians of nuclear drills. Now, as of the time of speaking, again, these extraordinary events are not being covered to any great extent in the media here in London, or indeed generally. And I think there are a number of reasons for this. One, I think, is the understandable one of not creating alarm and concern amongst the public. Well, one can argue whether that's an appropriate thing to do. Perhaps, given how tense the situation is, people ought to be at least concerned, if not alarmed. But anyway, I will put that aside. The second, I think, is that the British government and the American and French governments understand that in a situation like this, they need to preserve some scope for diplomatic maneuver. And I personally suspect that some of them at least are concerned, some of the officials of these governments are concerned, that if the nature of the Russian protests is made public, then there will be demands from all the usual people in Washington, London, Paris, and Brussels for Western governments to take a strong stand and retaliate with diplomatic démarches of their own, at which point it's entirely possible that the whole situation could indeed start to spiral out of control. So anyway, one way or the other, we still have silence from all of these Western capitals, or relative silence from all of these Western capitals about what has happened, though, as we've seen, we have had a whole succession of statements from Western governments saying that they're not going to deploy, or have no plans at the moment to deploy, Western troops to Ukraine, and the specific claim that the French Foreign Legion is currently in Ukraine, well, that claim is not true. And there's been media reports as well, one I believe from the Associated Press, which says that they have investigated the matter and that they too can confirm that the French Foreign Legion is not currently present in Ukraine. I have to say, I would take those claims with a certain skepticism. It's perhaps worth bearing in mind that we've had an accumulation of evidence for some time that the French Foreign Legion, or at least members of the French Foreign Legion, have been present in Ukraine at various times, acting as contractors or mercenaries or volunteers or whatever you want to call them. I suspect that what was actually happening is that there was an attempt to insert these troops, or to give the impression, to publicize, to announce publicly the fact that those troops were indeed there. And now that the Russians have responded in the way that they have done, there is once again a retreat into deniability, which, to be clear, I think the Russians will go along with. There are, however, a number of points I want to make about the situation. Firstly, about the presence of Western troops in Ukraine. I don't think the Russians are especially concerned about the deployment of NATO military contingents to Ukraine. I think the Russians have assessed the scale of European armies, about which they are very well informed, and I think that they have come to the view, which is the view shared by most people, that European armies are in no condition to fight the Russian army, and if they were deployed to Ukraine with only conventional weapons, they would not cause the Russians any particular problems. The thing I suspect which worries the Russians, and this is, well, it's my view, but it's also been suggested to me by someone who has been emailing me, and this person says that this is also a view amongst some senior people in Russia, is that if Western troops were to enter Ukraine, given the fact that there is this enormous imbalance in conventional forces between European troops that could be deployed to Ukraine and the Russian army, there is at least a possibility that those European troops could come with nuclear weapons with them. Now, I am not saying that that is anybody's plan in NATO, but of course the Russians don't know that for a fact, and that is why they are reacting so strongly to all discussion of deployment of NATO forces in Ukraine. For the record, I believe that as soon as there is a public announcement of the presence of NATO forces in Ukraine, the Russians will react immediately and they will attack those forces anywhere that they are in Ukraine. I think the Russians believe and understand, and I suspect that there is a general understanding, that provided these troops remain below the radar, they will not have with them nuclear weapons, and the Russians, that they won't be relaxed about it, will not respond too aggressively. But if, as I said, the presence of those troops is publicly confirmed, then the situation changes and the Russians will respond in the way that I have said. I think that that is certainly the view that I would take, and I would suggest that Western governments consider it and make their decisions accordingly. Now, there's a number of further points which I do want to make following all of this. Firstly, I said yesterday that the fact that the US ambassador had left Moscow and is traveling to Washington, I thought that that might be connected with the fact that the British and French ambassadors had been called into the foreign ministry to be given these very powerful warnings from the Russians. I've now seen it suggested that the true reason why the US ambassador returned to the United States was because the US government does not want her present in Moscow during the period of Putin's inauguration. Apparently, the German government has also recalled the German ambassador from Moscow, and that this is the reason being given. Well, perhaps, but I don't think this is particularly important one way or the other. Anyway, my own view is that the worst of this crisis is now past us. I think crisis is not too strong a word about what has happened over the last couple of days, but it's important to say that it could recur again. I hope that, as I said, the full lesson has now been absorbed in London, Paris, Berlin, Brussels, and Washington, though I'm far from confident that that is the case. Let's now turn to what is actually going on the battlefronts, because the Russian offensive, and since the Russians themselves are calling it an offensive, I think that is the word we should use. The Russian offensive continues, and it is in fact intensifying, and it is having a devastating effect on the Ukrainian military. Now, yesterday, I understand the Russian Defense Ministry claimed that total Ukrainian losses, dead and wounded, over the course of yesterday came to around 1,500 men. Now, if so, that is the heaviest, the largest number of losses Ukraine has suffered on a single day since the start of the special military operation. So we can see that even as the Ukrainian army is weakening on the battlefields, even as Ukrainian officials and Ukrainian officers complain about the shortage of men that they have to fight with, their casualty rate, according to the Russians, is growing. Of course, the Russian Defense Ministry doesn't publish analogous figures for Russian casualties, but my own sense, and I believe that this is also validated by the Media Zona project, is that Russian losses at the moment are remaining fairly at a fairly contained level. The other thing that becomes obvious at a glance when one looks at Russian Defense Ministry updates, which I have been talking about now for some time, is that the Russians are systematically destroying Ukraine's arsenal of artillery guns. Every day I read, when I look at the Russian Defense Ministry updates, of more and more artillery pieces destroyed in various parts of the battlefronts. And it is clear to me that the Russians are not only attacking and destroying Ukrainian regular units, but they are specifically targeting Ukraine's artillery. And if you believe the Russian reports, which, by the way, on this I generally do, then this is having a devastating effect, and Ukraine must be losing, or must have lost by now, a very high proportion of its total artillery forces. The other thing is that the Russians are continuing to destroy Ukrainian armored vehicles. And a couple of days ago, about a week ago in fact, there was a report which was widely circulated in the Western news media that a decision had been taken to withdraw the US Abrams tanks from the battle lines. They were apparently too vulnerable to Russian attack. This has caused embarrassment to the United States, and the result is that a decision had been taken to withdraw them to the rear. Well, the military unit that operates the Abrams tanks, the Ukrainian 47th Mechanized Brigade, has apparently publicly pushed back against this. They are refusing, or they're saying that they have no intention of withdrawing their tanks from the battlefronts. Frankly, if they did withdraw, pull back their Abrams tanks, the 47th Mechanized Brigade would be left, at least temporarily, without tanks. And the reality is that over the last couple of days, there have been multiple pictures of more Abrams tanks being destroyed. I'm not sure how many. Some suggest 3. Perhaps that's the correct number over the last couple of days, in which case, out of the 31 Abrams tanks, which we were told Ukraine was given, 8 have now been destroyed. That's around a quarter of the total. There are also many pictures of Bradley infantry fighting vehicles being destroyed as well. So the destruction of Ukraine's artillery arsenal and its armored vehicle arsenal continues. Of course, the Russians also lose armored vehicles, and there's lots of pictures from Ukrainian drone footage and that kind of thing of Russian tanks and armored vehicles also being hit and destroyed by Ukrainian drone attacks especially. But the Russians have a massive reserve of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and other armored vehicles, and of course they have established large production of this kind of equipment, and they seem to have no problem replacing whatever armored vehicles that they lose. And it's not surprising that the Russians therefore target Ukrainian armored vehicles, because Ukrainians don't have the same ability to replace their own losses. Now, all of this leads me to the next key point, which is that a couple of days ago, in his, I thought, calamitous interview with The Economist, President Macron floated the possibility of Western forces being deployed to Ukraine if Ukraine specifically asked for this to happen. Well, as night follows day, we now have apparently a request for Western troops to be sent to Ukraine, apparently appearing on President Zelensky's website. I haven't seen it myself, but I suspect it is indeed there. That's what I am seeing reports say. The Russians are already protesting about it. I've already discussed earlier in the program what a disastrous effect it might have if Western troops were deployed to Ukraine in the way that is being said. And Macron not only floated that possibility, but he gave the Ukrainians a means to facilitate it, and we now see the effect. I hope and believe that the West will disregard this Ukrainian request, if that is what it is, but given the scale of Ukrainian manpower and equipment losses, nobody should be surprised that the Ukrainians, having now been offered the opportunity, are making the request that they are now making. Let's turn to the actual battlefield news. Now, last night we had another massive missile and drone strike by the Russians across the territory of Ukraine. Allegedly around 60 missiles, long-range cruise missiles, were launched. Some of these included Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. The Ukrainians, by the way, I believe, are claiming that the Russians manufacture around 4 Kinjal missiles a month. I cannot understand how that could be possible on the basis of the numbers of Kinjal missiles that the Russians regularly launch in these strikes. The true production total must be much greater. I'm not going to try and guess what it actually is. But anyway, this was another massive drone and missile strike, and it seems to have taken place right across Ukraine. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry will probably later today provide us with more details on what exactly it was that was attacked and what damage was done, and we will no doubt get the usual inflated reports from the Ukrainians about the number of missiles and drones they will say that they shot down. For the record, and for the moment, I get the impression that the Russian missiles were able to cross Ukraine without encountering much resistance from whatever remains of Ukraine's air defense system. It seems that some of the missiles, perhaps a large proportion of the missiles, targeted facilities around Kiev, which historically has been the most heavily protected Ukrainian city. And again, I understand that there was little sign of the Ukrainian air defense system operating. However, these are early reports. It may be that when I return to this topic, the topic of this missile strike tomorrow, we will have a clearer picture. Perhaps the Ukrainian air defense system has been more active than I'm aware as of the time of making of this program. And anyway, one way or the other, we will get a better sense tomorrow of what exactly it was that the Russians were targeting, or what precise damage was done. Now, over the last couple of weeks, we have been hearing report after report, comment after comment, including from Ukrainian officials, Kirill Budanov specifically, about potential Ukrainian attacks on the Crimean Bridge. In fact, Kirill Budanov predicted that it would be destroyed over the course of the first half of this year. And, well, so far, it must be said, there has been no significant attack on the Crimean Bridge. There have been missile strikes against Crimea by the Ukrainians. ATACMS missiles have played a significant role in these missile strikes. But so far, to the best of my understanding, and certainly according to Russian Defense Ministry reports, these ATACMS missiles are not getting through. Some perhaps have done, but the vast majority of them, the Russian air defense system has been able to shoot down. Now, what we did have over the previous 36 hours was reports of a major attack on Crimea by Ukrainian drones, both airborne drones and shipborne drones, and water drones. But to all appearances, this attack was completely unsuccessful. I say unsuccessful. The only target that the Ukrainians apparently struck and destroyed with a drone was, by most accounts, a fishing boat. So, if there is a Ukrainian plan to attack the Crimean Bridge, for the moment, it doesn't seem to be working. And as I discussed in my programs, my previous two programs, it looks as if the Russians have given the British specific warnings about the risks Britain might run if British missiles are used to attack the Crimean Bridge. And for the moment, perhaps the British have backed off helping the Ukrainians carry out those strikes. So anyway, massive Russian missile and drone attacks across Ukraine, doing probably extensive damage. For the moment, Ukrainian counterattacks, which have never been especially strong, missile and drone attacks, looking as if they're ineffective. Now, all of this is happening alongside lots of activity on the ground. Now, over the last couple of hours, or at least perhaps 24, 36 hours, there have been reports that the Ukrainians have now been fully expelled, pushed out of Rabotino, this obliterated village in Zaporozhye region, which was the epicenter of the battle during Ukraine's summer offensive, which the Ukrainians were hoping to capture on the first day of that offensive on the 7th of June, but which they struggled to capture right through the summer, suffering colossal losses, especially in armored vehicles, over the course of it. Well, a couple of months ago, when the Russians first began tentative operations against Rabotino, I remember the President Zelensky visited, or allegedly visited, Rabotino, told the troops there that they should keep fighting and that they should keep Rabotino under Ukrainian control. If Rabotino is indeed once again fully under Russian control, or is in the process of coming fully under the Russian control, this will be another example of President Zelensky telling Ukrainian troops to stand and fight and protect territory, which in the event they're unable to hold on to. I've made my own views about Rabotino and this whole area entirely clear. The Ukrainians controlled no part of it before August 2023. It is not, therefore, part of Ukraine's historic defense system since the start of the special military operation. There is no point or meaning to Ukraine trying to cling on to some place like Rabotino. Far better for the Ukrainians to have pulled back to places like the town of Orechov, which they can presumably defend much more effectively. This has been a pointless and unnecessary sacrifice done, as far as I can see, purely for public relations purposes. Now, the same would be true if the Ukrainians really are planning some kind of return to Krinky. This is this village on the east bank of the Dnieper River, in which the Ukrainians landed back in the autumn. They clung on to a bridgehead there. They suffered appalling losses over the process of doing that. The media in the West started to publish complaints from Ukrainian soldiers who had been told to defend this bridgehead. They were complaining about the pointlessness of it all and the incredible losses that they were suffering in holding on to this bridgehead. If it is indeed the Ukrainian plan to return to Krinky, as many are suggesting, there are some who actually claim that the Ukrainians are already there, though I have to say I've not really seen much convincing evidence of that. But anyway, if that is indeed the Ukrainian plan, then it seems to me that it would be another example of the Ukrainians doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different result, with Ukrainian soldiers once more paying the price for the folly. Now, let's move on from these two perhaps less important battlefronts and look at the situation as it's unfolding in the places where it really matters. The first thing to say is that there's been, again, a cascade of reports over the last 24 hours, more precisely over the last 12 hours or so, that the Russians, having now fully consolidated control of the industrial district at the center of the town of Krasnogorovka, the town that lies between Marinka and Avdiivka, the last major urban center close to Donetsk city that remains even partially under Ukrainian control, Marinka and Avdiivka having both fallen. Anyway, the reports say that the Russians, having consolidated control of the industrial zone and having reorganized their forces in Krasnogorovka, have once again gone on to the attack, and that Ukrainian defenses in the north of Krasnogorovka are disintegrating, and that Ukrainian positions in the east of Krasnogorovka, northeast part of Krasnogorovka, are now at serious risk of becoming cut off. These reports, which are fairly detailed, also speak of heavy bombing by the Russian Air Force of Ukrainian positions in this remaining area of Krasnogorovka under Ukrainian control, and of Russian flamethrower systems, the TOS-1 and TOS-2 systems, and heavy Russian mortars, the 240mm Tulpan mortars, all operating to devastating effect in Krasnogorovka. Again, this is another example, in my opinion, of the Ukrainians defending territory that they have no real possibility of defending and experiencing huge losses attempting to do this. Now, the Russians have taken their time to capture Krasnogorovka. I suspect, again, the main issue is this Russian desire, which we have seen throughout the special military operation, to avoid casualties as much as possible. That it means that the Russians take careful steps first to bomb and shell and drone attack Ukrainian defensive positions in places like Krasnogorovka until resistance in these places is, to all intents and purposes, suppressed, so that when the Russian infantry advances, Ukrainian resistance is reduced and quickly collapses. But the point is that this slow, gradual, relentless grind not only ultimately achieves this effect of capturing contested territory, but it not only reduces Russian casualties, which is, I suspect, one of the major priorities, but it hugely increases Ukrainian ones, because the Ukrainians always respond to any pause in a Russian advance by reinforcing the threatened position, which ultimately causes more Ukrainian lives to be lost. As I have said many times, throughout this conflict, for one reason or another, the Ukrainians have persistently reinforced failure, and it is now increasingly coming to haunt them. And we can see this playing out now further north in the Ocheretino Avdiivka area. The Russians, as I've said have recently consolidated control of Arkhangelsk, and it seems from most reports that the place where they're now focusing their advance is to the west of Ocheretino. In particular, they seem to be making serious attempts to try and capture the villages of Alexandrovka, and also they seem to be pushing westwards towards two other villages, Sokol, which is immediately to the west of Ocheretino, and Solovyova, which the Russians, by the way, confirmed the capture of, I think it was about a day ago, and also further west a village called Progress. Now, there's a lot of speculation as to why the Russians at the moment are focusing on advancing westwards, perhaps ultimately towards Pakrovsk, as opposed to advancing eastwards, taking control of the villages to the west of the H20 highway, villages like Alexandropil, Pantelimonivka, Valentinivka, Sukha-Balka, and the rest. But anyway, that is what the Russians do. And as I've said, they have shown a consistent tendency to act unexpectedly and to take people by surprise and to do things which no one quite expects. But anyway, they do seem to be advancing westwards. Now, it is in this precise area, the area to the west of Ocheretino, and by the way, to the west of Berdichi, to the south, where the 47th Mechanized Brigade, the brigade which has been called the Fire Brigade of the Ukrainian Army, the brigade which has been fighting almost continuously since June of last year, the army with the Bradleys and the Abrams tanks, which have been destroyed, and before that, with many of the Leopard 2 tanks, which have also been destroyed. Well, it is in this area where this, by now, exhausted brigade is still fighting. And the reason the Ukrainians are forced to keep this brigade in battle is because they have fewer and fewer reserves that they can send to try to keep front lines stable. And yesterday, I saw a report on the Military Summary channel that the Ukrainians have also dispatched the 110th Mechanized Brigade to this area as well. Now, I remember the 110th Mechanized Brigade very well because that was the brigade that defended Avdiivka. It was involved in the fight in Avdiivka from October until February, when Avdiivka eventually fell. The brigade suffered terrible losses during that fighting. Its men were exhausted. They were making repeated complaints about the fact that they were being kept in the battle for too long and that they weren't getting the rotations that they needed. After the fall of Avdiivka, they were sent to the rear for a rest and a refit, Well, just a few weeks later, long before that rest and refit can possibly have been completed, the brigade has apparently been thrown back into the battle to try to stem the Russian advance in the Ocheretino area. Now, this is the entirely predictable result of Ukraine's decisions to hold on and defend undefendable territory for as long as the Ukrainians do. The burden of that is borne by the Ukrainian soldiers who die and are wounded in terrible numbers, with the survivors left traumatized and exhausted. And we see that again, they're being thrown into the battle without being given an opportunity, a proper rest. A more conservative policy of husbanding resources would have served the Ukraine far better. And going back to that article that appeared back in August by George Beebe and Jim Webb, a policy also for Ukraine of remaining on the defensive and building up proper fortified lines, perhaps not on the scale of the Surovikin line, which I suspect has always been beyond Ukraine's reach, but at any rate, proper fortified lines in defensible positions would also have served the Ukrainians better, instead of going on these ultimately fruitless offensives like the one they engaged in Kharkiv in the autumn of 2022, in Kherson region in the autumn of 2022, and catastrophically in Zaporozhye and Bakhmut areas in the summer of 2022, which have exhausted their forces and reduced their number and inflated their casualties even more. Well, the fortifications have not been built, not to any degree, and apparently there is now an avalanche of complaints from Ukrainian soldiers in the Ocheretino area, in this area of Novo-Alexandrovka, Sokol, Progress, that there are no fortifications, no proper trenches or positions to fall back on and to retreat to, and to try to hold the Russians back from. The Ukrainians between 2014 and 2022 successfully created powerful fortified lines in Donbass, close to Donetsk city, and elsewhere. Those fortified lines have now crumbled, but in contrast to the Surovikin line, the Russian Surovikin line, which has a whole network of layered defensives going back tens of kilometers, there is nothing remotely like that in terms of Ukraine's own defenses in Donbass. It seems that the Ukrainians convinced themselves that the fortifications in Avdiivka would be all but impenetrable, and when Avdiivka unexpectedly fell in February, there was nothing of substance further back to which the Ukrainians could retreat. Now, the Ukrainians have been trying to improvise defense lines, but of course, their ability to do so when retreating and under fire with, I suspect, inadequate equipment and materials is obviously insufficient for the situation. So, the Russians continuing to push forward, more, as I said, reports of Bradley's being captured. there are reports, as I've said already, about fighting in Novo-Alexandrovka and in Sokol. And there's also reports that the Russians have reached the village of Novopokrovske, and they seem to be preparing to advance beyond that village to another village called Novoselivka Persha, which lies on the water barriers, which many thought would be the next Ukrainian defense line. But it looks as if that defense line is going to crumble as well fairly quickly over the next couple of weeks. So, a disastrous situation which is just getting worse, and with Ukraine struggling to hold back the Russian forces, with tired and exhausted brigades, with equipment that they're losing rapidly, and with no clear defense lines to fall back to. Now, the other major area where fighting continues to happen is Chasiv Yar. And here I will say again that we have less information about what is actually taking place. The Russian Defense Ministry, again, appears to be controlling the news from Chasiv Yar and the area around it, from Bakhmut and the area around it, very tightly. But we've had more reports of Russian forces fighting inside the micro-district. I know that has been disputed by some people. There's been more reports of relentless Russian bombing of Ukrainian defenses in Chasiv Yar. And also, the Russians seem to be mopping up the Ukrainian defense lines around that village of Klesheyevka to the southwest of Bakhmut. Another place the Ukrainians struggled to recapture at appalling loss over the course of their offensive of the summer of 2023. Tiny place of 500 people, by the way, before the war. But anyway, the Ukrainians have made some huge, attributed some huge totemic significance to it. They've tried to keep troops in and around Klesheyevka for weeks beyond any possible sense and logic in defending their positions in Klesheyevka. When Ivanivska, Krasnoye, fortified village to the north, fell under Russian control some weeks ago, it ought to have been obvious that Ukrainian defenses around Klesheyevka and Andreevka further south had become undefendable. But yet again, the Ukrainians insisting on defending this ground rather than falling back to more defendable positions, perhaps along the Seversky Donetsk Canal, where, to reiterate again, proper defense lines ought to have been established months, if not years ago. But anyway, fighting is taking place there, playing again directly into the Russian strategy, the strategy I've described as aggressive attrition, Ukrainian troops trying to defend themselves in this area, suffering undoubtedly severe losses, but ultimately unable to hold on to their positions around Klesheyevka and Andreevka, guaranteeing that when the Russians do reach the Seversky Donetsk Canal in this area as well, which they will, Ukrainian positions there will also be inadequately defended. Lastly, there's lots of news which I find very difficult to make much sense of, but others with a better understanding of things than me have tried to piece it all together. But there's lots of news coming from the Kupiansk area and from the territories further south. Firstly, the Russians, as I've discussed, have captured those two villages of Kislovka and Kotlerovka. They captured Tabayevka, another village in that area, some months ago. This is places to the south of Kupiansk, southeast of Kupiansk. Supposedly that puts them in a strong position ultimately to advance towards the Oskol River. And the Russians also, according to some reports, are now working towards capturing a further village in this area called Ivanka. Well, we'll see what the Russians do precisely in this area. The Kupiansk sector has been relatively quiet for a long time, though going back to what I said about a major uptick in Ukrainian losses over the last day, it seems as if Ukrainian casualties around Kupiansk are also spiking again. But perhaps it's further south that the reports are taking on an even more dramatic quality. Apparently, the weather is very hot in this part of Ukraine at the moment, and the Russians, and it can only be the Russians if you look at the map, have apparently set fire to a large forested area to the west of the town the Russians control called Kremenaya. It's a forested area leading all the way up to Liman. And the Ukrainians have been using this forest to provide cover to their troops. The pictures of this fire are absolutely horrifying. They show smoke rising far into the sky. Any Ukrainian troops who are in this forest, and apparently there must be large numbers of them, must be going through a terrible experience. It's not, by the way, difficult to imagine how the Russians could set this forest on fire. After all, they have flamethrower tanks, they can drop thermobaric bombs on forests, they can do all kinds of things. But anyway, horrifying pictures, and well, the Military Summary Channel and others are saying that the destruction of this forest, which by the way is an ecological tragedy, though forests can be revived. But anyway, the destruction of this forest is going to again weaken Ukrainian defenses in this whole area, and this forested area leads all the way up to Liman, further to the west. Liman, of course, was the town. Russians captured it in May 2022. The Ukrainians recaptured it, I believe it was in November 2022, the high point of their Kharkiv counteroffensive. The Russians have, over the last few months, played a complex game of advancing towards the village of Terny on the Zherebets River. They pulled back, but not that far. There were some reports of a Ukrainian counterattack east of Terny. I've not really myself seen very much evidence of that. But anyway, the Russians have been playing a game of hide and seek with the Ukrainians in this area. But the fact that they've now set the entire forest on fire in the way that they've done, well, again, that looks to me like further evidence that the Russians this time are preparing at some point to return to this area in force, just as the capture of Kislovka and Kotlerovka might be a sign that the Kupiansk operation is about to restart. Now, there's been an awful lot of discussion in recent weeks about Group of Forces North, this new force supposedly commanded by General Lapin, which the Russians have created in the Belgorod area. Lots of speculation of a Russian offensive to capture the city of Kharkiv being what is planned. I'm going to throw in, for what it's worth, probably very little, my own guess, by the way, which is that while I suspect the Russians will try to occupy some territory around Kharkiv, it's unlikely that they are currently planning an attack on Kharkiv itself. I think it is much more likely that the purpose of group of forces north will be to complete the business of capturing Kupiansk and moving on to ETHEREUM and Balakleya, recovering, in other words, the territory that Russia lost during the Kharkiv offensive, Ukraine's Kharkiv offensive, and also recovering the town, capturing the town of Liman. And the Russians have been making aggressive moves, positioning their forces around further east around the town of Siversk. They've been launching attacks on Belogorovka, and they've been advancing up the railways towards this railway station called Vrimka. They're apparently fighting inside Razdolovka. These have been, so far as I can see, relatively attacks conducted by relatively small forces, but clearly they're probing and shaping the territory around Siversk for a major offensive to capture that town. And it seems to me that one can see that as the Russians press forward with their breakthrough in the Avdiivka or Ocheretino sector, they're probably working towards a major advance to end the battle for Donbass once and for all by capturing Chasiv Yar, which will open the way for an advance to Kramatorsk, which, by the way, over the last couple of hours, they have apparently bombed, and to advance via Siversk and Liman towards the other place, the other northern part of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, which is, of course, Slavyansk itself. So maybe, just maybe, the Russian plan is for the forces in Ocheretino to sort out Pokrovsk, the forces in Krasnogorovka to cut off the supply lines to Vuhledar, the fortified town in the south, and the Russians are now positioned forces around Vuhledar, and it looks as if they're planning some kind of offensive there. And the Russian forces that are building up in Kharkiv region and in Siversk, they might be intended to target Slavyansk. So possibly attacks on Vuhledar, Pokrovsk, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, all happening at roughly the same time. I'm not saying these are exactly coordinated. Maybe that's the Russian plan. I'm not sure. What I will say about Russian offensive actions, and I've said it before, but I want to say it again, is that yes, we are seeing a Russian offensive playing out at the moment, but it continues to be conducted by only a fraction of the ground forces that the Russians have available. They're keeping large numbers of troops in the rear. Some speculate that those troops are there to counter the arrival of any NATO forces into Ukraine. But as I've said, I doubt very much that in terms of numbers, any conventional forces that NATO sends into Ukraine could make a significant amount of difference. It seems to me more likely that the Russians are still in the process of building up and equipping their forces. The existing troops who are fighting in all of these places that I've just talked about are, in the meantime, preparing the battlefronts. And we still have, and this is a key thing to remember, the whole of the summer and early autumn up to October left for a big offensive with mechanized forces to take place. So we are probably still at the early stages of this process. I say that, though the Russians have been conducting offensive operations continuously now since October, with the Ukrainians becoming weaker all the time. So there we are, a very difficult situation on the battlefronts in Ukraine. It's perhaps unsurprising that in the West all sorts of ideas have been circulating about inserting NATO troops into Ukraine, these coming from Macron, about arms packages and that kind of thing. But the realities are that the military situation in Ukraine, Ukraine's military situation, is deteriorating, and it is deteriorating fast. And in Ukraine itself, the strains are increasingly beginning to show. Now, there were reports a couple of days ago that the United States has lost patience with Zelensky. We've heard that many times, that they're speaking to various alternative Ukrainian officials who might take over from him. Zaluzhny, Poroshenko, Klitschko. I've discussed all that in a recent video. Well, we'll see what comes of all of that. But yesterday, we got reports of an assassination attempt, a planned assassination attempt on President Zelensky. And two officers, apparently of officers serving Ukraine's military intelligence organization, that's Budanov's organization, were apparently implicated or allegedly implicated in this assassination attempt and had been arrested. And the assassination attempt was apparently detected by the SBU, Ukraine's internal security agency, which, from what I could tell, seems to be the most reliable agency from Zelensky's point of view, still left within the Ukrainian institutional system. Now, the Ukrainians are saying that the Russians are implicated in this assassination attempt. The Russians, if they wanted to, could probably target and kill President Zelensky whenever they chose. I'm fairly sure they have a pretty comprehensive idea of his movements. They probably know where he is at any particular point in time. Even if they don't have complete knowledge, they surely know where he will be at important moments. They have, as we've seen, large numbers of missiles and drones and things of that kind. It's difficult to believe that they couldn't target and kill him if they chose to. A couple of weeks ago, he was in Odessa with a Western leader. I can't remember which one. It might have been Prime Minister Mitsotakis of Greece. But anyway, he was there, and apparently his motorcade and that of Prime Minister Mitsotakis, if it was him, was tracked by a Russian drone. In the event there was a missile strike, it was not, however, on President Zelensky. It was on a water drone facility, which the Russians which was clearly the primary Russian target. However, it's not impossible that the Russians are implicated in this event in some way. I know that there is skepticism about this, but there would be an advantage for the Russians if they really wanted Zelensky out of the way, if it could be arranged that it were done by Ukrainian military officials. It would demonstrate the unrest, the level of unrest and opposition to the current government within Ukraine. So this is a possibility that cannot be excluded. Having said that, perhaps we shouldn't spend too much time thinking about it. The key point is the Ukrainians themselves are telling us that 2 Ukrainian colonels, senior officers, were implicated in an assassination attempt on Ukraine's head of state. Now, we've been hearing lots of reports, rumors about possible coups in Ukraine. This has been an ongoing story since the start of the special military operation. I've covered many of these rumors in the past. But here we have confirmation from the Ukrainians themselves that 2 senior officers in the Ukrainian military were apparently planning to murder Zelensky and apparently were working to try and involve other Ukrainian military personnel in their plan. This does not speak of a good situation in Ukraine. Again, this story is not getting the attention that it deserves. And bear in mind that we're getting these reports about this assassination attempt at the same time as there's been all these reports, which I've discussed many times, about unrest in Ukrainian army units. The 3rd Assault Brigade repeatedly refusing to obey orders, the 67th Brigade retreating without orders, the 115th Brigade doing exactly the same. There's reports today that an artillery unit has also retreated without orders. Complaints from the 79th Brigade in Novomikhailivka that they've been abandoned. The 47th Mechanized Brigade, very unhappy that it's being forced to fight constantly without rotations. We could go on. And now we have had the first clear sign that personnel in Ukraine's armed forces, senior personnel in Ukraine's armed forces, have been thinking of assassinating President Zelensky himself. And we're getting these reports not from the Russians, but from the Ukrainians. This is a very bad situation. It suggests that Ukraine is in serious crisis. Perhaps Ukraine's external creditors understand this, because apparently the creditors have now said that they're no longer prepared to extend Ukraine's holiday from debt repayments beyond August, and they're apparently in some kind of discussions with Ukraine about how Ukraine is to resume payment of its debts, something which it obviously cannot by itself afford to do. The wheels are starting to come off. I'm not saying that there's a collapse going to happen tomorrow or next week or in a month. There's still intense fighting going on in Donbass, but we can see that the situation in Donbass is becoming critical, and we can also see that the Western military aid is proving inadequate for the situation. Instead of coming up with these reckless plans to send troops to Ukraine, talk about deep strikes on Russian territory, which have brought us now to the position where the Russians are carrying out drills with nuclear weapons, which, by the way, have extended to Belarus, with the Belarus military now participating, and to these, frankly, terrifying warnings from the Russians to the British and the French. The time has come. It is desperately overdue. It is urgent for someone finally to do that which no one in the West appears to be prepared to do, which is to pick up the telephone to Moscow, call Putin and say, look, this situation is in serious danger of getting out of control. We agree that peace must now be agreed, and we accept your fundamental condition that Ukraine cannot join NATO, that there cannot be Western troops stationed on any basis, permanently or even temporarily, in Ukraine, and that the 4 regions will not be returned to Ukraine. I think on the latter, virtually everybody now acknowledges that this is going to be the case. So why not concede it now and achieve peace? The destruction of Ukraine is continuing every day. Missile strikes, massive losses on the front lines, but we are now closer than we have ever been, at least since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, to a global confrontation between nuclear superpowers involving the threat of use of nuclear weapons. If this is not a time to speak, I don't know what is. Anyway, I'm going to finish my program at this point. I will be returning to all these troubling and concerning topics tomorrow. Let me say again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Please remember that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you can buy all the amazing things that are there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.